Hello. Thank you for joining me. My name is John J. Dominguez. I would like to introduce my book to you, my fellow YouTube viewers. It is a book of science fiction and horror entitled Q. The main character is Q, a supernatural being who is composed of pure red primordial light, but at the same time, he is a black hole who takes human form. He was once the mortal Romulus, Rome's first supposed king. There is a 3,000-year-old legend about Romulus that relates that one day, after serving as Rome's first king for 38 years, he all of a sudden disappeared in a storm. His body was never found. Afterwards, the Roman people said that he had been taken up to heaven by his father Mars, the Roman god of war. The Romans then worshipped Romulus as a god and gave him the name of Quirinus. Thus, the title of my book is Q, and is about Quirinus, or Romulus, and what really happened to him after he disappeared in the storm 3,000 years ago. In his travel through time to 1888 Victorian London, Q encounters Jack the Ripper, history's greatest serial killer, who in reality is a billion-year-old alien named Xeno, who was also a soul catcher and later becomes Q's arch nemesis, next to Q's other rival, his twin brother, who was both a master vampire and Lucifer's adopted son. This is just a brief summary of the first several chapters of Q. I will present Q as an audiobook, that is, I read and tape recorded my manuscript. I sincerely hope you enjoy my book Q, which I most humbly present to you. And now, Q, copyright 2002 by John J. Dominguez. Following is the beginning of Q, Chapter 1, copyright by John J. Dominguez, MD. Chapter 1, Q, Chapter 1, the beginning. He comes for you, said a sultry female voice. Who comes for me? Replied a voice in a strong masculine tone. Why, your brother, dear King Romulus, replied the woman. You are crazy, witch. My brother has been dead for over 20 years. I killed him myself. When you're dead, and there is no coming back. Amygdala, the witch, looked even more deeply into the beautiful purple-streaked marble basin filled with water and herbs, then said, well, it is and it isn't your brother. What? Speak clearly, witch, and say what you mean, exclaimed Romulus. Amygdala was practicing a form of divination called hydromancia, whereby she could see visions of things far away by looking into water. In this case, by looking into the beautiful marble basin filled with water and herbs that was normally used for washing hands. Amygdala then looked up at Romulus with her beautiful green eyes, and as she walked toward him, she said, he was your mortal brother Remus, but now he is something different and much more powerful. He is evil incarnate. He is a vampire. What is a vampire? Asked a most curious King Romulus. A vampire is a creature of the night, an undead being or person without a soul, whose sole purpose in life is to spread the plague of vampirism among humankind, and in the process commit unspeakable acts of evil and depredation, replied the beautiful porcelain white-skinned druid witch, as she then turned around and walked back to the water-filled marble basin where she once again peered into its dark, still depths. She stared into the water with a great intensity as Romulus jokingly said, "You're crazy, Amygdala. There are no such things as vampires. Besides, the gods are with me. They will protect me, as they always have." Suddenly, Amygdala, spelled let out a horrible cry as she quickly turned away from the water and her eyes swelled with tears from the shock of the vision she had just witnessed in the marble basin. No, it can't be, she said as she cried and tears rolled down her cheeks. What is it? What did you see that disturbed you so, Amygdala? Asked Romulus as he walked to her and gently placed his hands on her shoulders to comfort her. She just shook her head as if to say, no. What was it? Tell me, said Romulus. She just remained silent, still crying. Finally, King Romulus gently put his hand on her chin and turned her head. Her eyes were filled with tears, and her face had a sad, somber look on it as she said, He will kill you, Romulus. You will suffer a horrible, painful death. But I can convert you into something that will allow you to defeat him. It is your only chance. What do you mean? Do you think that I am afraid of him, period? I killed him once. I can certainly kill him again, whatever he may be, even if he is a so-called vampire. I never run away from a fight. You have been with me long enough to know that, Amygdala, said Romulus. But my lord, he is too powerful, period. He will kill you. I have seen it in the water, she said with an air of desperation. Her feelings went beyond those of pure friendship, to those of actual physical desire for the handsome monarch. Amygdala was King Romulus's personal witch of some 20 years. She was a druid witch who had somehow found her way from the great forests of England to Rome. She actually helped him to succeed by casting spells on Romulus's enemies, thereby clearing the way for his absolute and uncontested rule as King of Rome. Yes, indeed, Camilla. Romulus owed much of his success to her and her practice of magic in his favor. New paragraph. Even though she looked beautiful and young, she was actually old, very old. She was at least 500 years old. She had managed to keep herself looking young by having discovered the secret of the Philosopher's Stone, that crimson-colored substance that represents the final triumph of the Hermetic philosophy and extends life to its utmost length, to immortality. It is the elixir of life, the elixir vitae, that is, new paragraph, said Romulus as he held the most distressed witch tightly in his arms and caressed her light reddish-brown hair she had pinned up. Go home and rest. You're tired. I'm sure tomorrow things will be much better, said Romulus as she interjected, quote, But Romulus, you don't understand. He is coming. At this very moment, he marches on the highway, straight to Rome, and right here to the gates of your palace. Romulus just smiled, looking straight into her green eyes with his pretty light yellowish-brown honey-colored eyes, and said, Go home and rest, Amygdala. Tomorrow's another day. She turned around and reluctantly walked away, saying, If you need me, you know where I'll be. The beautiful druid witch then disappeared through a dark doorway. New paragraph. As soon as she disappeared, Romulus shouted, Cassius, come here at once. The sound of rapidly approaching footsteps could be heard. Then a young man came, rushing into the room. Yes, my lord. What dost, spelled D-O-S-T, thou wish? Asked the young man, who was somewhat short of breath from the rapid sprinting he had just undertaken to get to the king from a point way across the palace. Go fetch Flavius at once, commanded Romulus. Yes, my lord. Your wish is my command, replied the young page, who then quickly turned around and darted out the palace. A short while later, the young man arrived, accompanied by a tall, muscular soldier. You called, my king, said the tall man. Yes, come, Flavius. I have a task for you, replied Romulus. What does my lord wish? Asked the Roman soldier, who was actually the chief of the palace guard. There is a man approaching Rome on the highway from the north. I want you to take your men and intercept and kill him with extreme prejudice, said Romulus, who then went on to give a description of the intended target. After the two men were done talking, the soldier bowed his head and said, Consider it done, my king. He then turned around and proceeded to walk away. "Don't disappoint me, Flavius," exclaimed Romulus, as the head of his palace guard, who had been walking away, suddenly stopped to ponder the king's words for a second without turning around, then proceeded to walk out the room. Romulus walked to a window and watched as Flavius gathered 21 of his best-trained men in the palace courtyard, where he told them their mission. With somber faces, the 22 men left the palace and headed north to intercept the mysterious stranger. Romulus watched as the last man passed through the palace gates, then turned around and walked back inside, where he sat at a beautiful marble table and stared at the salmon-colored streak coursing through it like veins. He then began to recall the past and his long-dead brother Remus. It all began some 54 years earlier, when two twin baby boys were tossed by their great-uncle Amulius into the waters of an overflowing Tiber River, where they were supposed to drown. But instead, as fate would have it, the two twins were washed ashore under the shade of a fig tree, where a she-wolf found them and suckled them. Each boy would ravenously grab a teat with his right hand and suck voraciously. In addition, two woodpeckers, a red-headed one and a yellow-headed one, would take turns feeding the little boys morsels of food several times a day, ensuring their sustenance. Then one day, not long thereafter, the twins were found by a shepherd named Faustulus, spelled capital Faustulus, who took the twins home with him to his wife, Acca Larentia, who named them Remus and Romulus. They became strong young shepherds. All those years that they were growing up, their great-uncle Amulius, who had thrown them into the Tiber River to drown and die, was king of Latium, for he had deposed his older brother Numitor, who was the rightful king of Latium. Numitor was the twin brothers Remus and Romulus's grandfather, or their mother's father. Thus, in order to make certain there would be no contestation to his right to the throne of Latium, Amulius needed to eliminate all male heirs to the throne. Originally, after having deposed his older brother Numitor, Amulius sent Silvia Rhea, Numitor's daughter, to a convent of sorts to live. There, he believed she would be celibate and remained childless. But by chance or destiny, Mars, the god of war, fell in love with Silvia Rhea and impregnated her. The result of that union were the twins Remus and Romulus. As the twins grew up to become strong young shepherd men, they had no idea of whom they really were, that is, the two princes of the kingdom of Latium. Amulius enjoyed some 18 years of uncontested absolute rule as king of Latium. Then one day there was a dispute between two shepherding factions. In those days, it was the custom that all disputes be brought before the king for settlement according to his wishes and wisdom. So the disputing shepherds appeared before King Amulius. Among them were Remus and Romulus. The king settled the dispute in favor of the twins, but the king sensed a strange and even regal presence about the two young men. He sensed that they were more than just two mere peasant shepherds. While in the city and celebrating the king's ruling in their favor, a strange old woman visited them. She sat at their table in the inn one night when everyone else was either stone cold drunk or passed out. The two twins were also inebriated, but still were pretty much coherent when the strangers sat at their table. Her head was covered with a hood, so they could only see small glimpses of her lips, face, and gray hair at times, as she took fleeting glimpses of them. "What is it you want, old woman?" asked Remus. She just looked around, making certain everyone else was passed out or totally drunk. She continued to look around and remained silent. please, what is it you want of us? Asked Romulus in a somewhat more mellow tone. Seemingly as if having said the right words, the old woman then turned around and began to speak, saying, "You too are not who you think you are. There is more to you and more in store for you. This destiny has decreed, I can assure you." "Stop speaking in riddles, you old bag," exclaimed a half-drunken Remus. The old woman kept her head bowed as when speaking before, but just shook her head in disapproval of Remus's attitude and tone towards her. "Please, can you tell us more about what you mean? It is not clear to us what you are trying to tell us, my lady," said Romulus. Remus shoved him, then shook his head and said, "You are always the romantic, aren't you? Can't you see she's drunk like everyone else here? She's talking foolishness. Don't pay attention to her anymore. Leave her alone." "No, I want to hear what she has to say," said Romulus as he stared at the old woman, who then slowly looked up at Romulus. It was dark inside the inn, and all Romulus could see of her hooded face were her two eyes that glowed with a dull red color, like two fading embers. Remus suddenly got up from his chair and stepped back at the sight of her eerie glowing eyes, but Romulus didn't budge. He just stayed staring at her. The old woman saw great courage and fearlessness in Romulus and started to tell her tale, saying, "You too are not who you think you are, period. You are not really shepherds. You were destined for greatness." "Yeah, right. Are we going to sit here and listen to this drunken old bag who's full of shit, or are we going to go do some serious drinking and womanizing?" interjected Remus, who then grabbed Romulus's left shoulder and tried to pull him away. But Romulus didn't budge. Instead, he stayed firm as a rock and said, "Go on, old woman. Tell us more." She nodded her head and continued, saying, "You too are princes." When she said this, she suddenly seemed to have gotten Remus's attention, for he turned around and became more attentive to her. Romulus remained just as attentive as before. "You are princes and the rightful heirs of the kingdom of Latium." Remus frowned at such an incomprehensible thought and blurted out, "How can that be? We are not related to King Amulius." "You're crazy, you old witch." "Enough, brother. Let her speak," commanded Romulus, as he then turned around to face the old woman again and said, "Pay no attention to my brother. Please continue. You too are great nephews of King Amulius. You are the grandsons of Numitor, the former king of Latium, who was deposed by his younger brother Amulius, the present king of this land. Amulius threw both of you into the Tiber River as newborns, expecting you to die, drown, thereby leaving him as the uncontested ruler of Latium. But as you are well aware, you were found and suckled by a she-wolf, and reared by Faustulus and his wife as their own sons. And so, here you are, the two of you, groping for a future, for a destiny, when now, more than ever, it should be very clear to you." The old woman stopped talking as Remus and Romulus pondered her words and incredible revelation. She arose, and as she turned around to walk away, Romulus caught a glimpse of her face. It was very deeply wrinkled and old, with locks of gray hair protruding across her face. Remus's imagination was going wild with thoughts of grandeur, of being a prince and even a future king, while Romulus remained somber and serious. He kept his eyes on her and watched as she walked away. He wanted to speak to her once more, so he ran off after her, stumbling over drunken, passed-out bodies on the inn's floor. Just as she turned the corner leading into a hallway, he caught up with her and hastily grasped her by both shoulders, turned her around, and threw back the hood to get a good look at the face of the one who had just, in a few minutes' time, changed their lives forever. New paragraph. Romulus flung the dark brown hood off of her head, and suddenly volumes of full-bodied reddish blonde hair burst forth. He was shocked at what he saw. It was a beautiful young woman with green eyes and beautiful, wrinkle-free pearly white skin. "I am sorry, my lady, but I thought you were someone else, an old woman whom I had been talking to. Please forgive me," said Romulus as he pulled back and turned around to walk away. "It is I who spoke to you and your brother," said the beautiful young-looking woman. Romulus froze in his tracks and slowly turned around to look at her with a look of amazement on his face. "It can't be. I saw the face of an old woman. I am certain of it," replied Romulus. "You have had much to drink, and the light is dim, both of which can play tricks on your eyes," said the woman calmly, as she moved closer to Romulus and pulled him over to a table where they sat down. She was Amygdala, the Druid witch, and such was how Romulus and Amygdala, his witch, first met. She had come to seek out Romulus as commanded by destiny. She was indeed old, at least 500 years old, and Romulus was right when he said that he had seen an old woman's face beneath the dark hood. Amygdala changed her appearance from that of an old woman to that of a young one. As they sat down, Romulus couldn't believe his eyes and was in awe of her beauty. "So tell me, where do you come from, and what is your name?"
If you like this, let me know.
Romulus, most curiously, period. "My name is Amygdala, and I come from an island called Britannia," she replied. "Why have you come here, Amygdala?" he asked. "I have come to help you claim what is rightfully yours, the throne of Latium," she replied. "But surely you must be insane, for King Amulius is too heavily guarded. Attempt to depose him would be suicide!" And quotations, uttered Romulus in a low and progressively quieter voice, as there were spies everywhere in the kingdom, including there at the inn. "Don't be afraid, my young prince, for I will help you to take back what is rightfully yours," she said. Suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, Remus appeared at the table, crashing their little gathering. He said, "Hey, brother, who is this luscious wench, spelled W-E-N-C-H, you have here? Certainly you weren't planning on keeping her all to yourself, were you?" "This is Amygdala." "Amygdala, this is my twin brother Remus," said Romulus most politely. Remus just smiled at the beautiful Amygdala, made a smooching gesture, then proceeded to stick out his tongue and move it round and round in a most suggestive, lewd, sexual fashion. "Enough. Stop it, Remus," snapped Romulus, as he then shoved Remus away. "Please forgive my brother. I am afraid he has had too much to drink," said Romulus most apologetically. "You two may be twins, but you are worlds apart in many ways," said Amygdala, as she stared at Romulus with her beautiful, mesmerizing, cat-like green eyes. There was something about him, about the way he carried himself. The air about him was distinctly regal. He was destined to be a king, and she knew it. But there was something else, a feeling, a sensation she hadn't felt before. It was not an objective thing. It was a subjective feeling that was somewhat foreign to her. It was love! It was something Amygdala had never felt before in her 500-year existence. Romulus was oblivious and totally unaware of her apparent feelings towards him. Amygdala checked into the inn. Remus and Romulus already had a room. The beautiful Druid witch went upstairs to bed, leaving the two young men to carry on with their drinking and womanizing. Remus slowly scurried away, leaving Romulus all alone downstairs. Romulus went upstairs to their room and laid down. His eyelids slowly began to close when suddenly he heard a commotion in the room next door. He heard a woman scream. Quickly, without hesitation, he got up, ran out of the room, and kicked open the door to the room next to him. There, he found Remus with his right hand around Amygdala's neck, choking her as he was spreading her legs apart, getting ready to rape her. Remus was so engrossed in the act that he didn't even turn around to see who or what it was that had kicked open the door to the room. Romulus ran and grabbed Remus, twisting his arm behind him and pulling him off of Amygdala, who coughed, gasped, and gagged. "Don't you ever let me catch you putting a hand on her again. You hear me?" shouted Romulus into his brother's left ear. "She's just a wench like any other. She, like all others, are only good for one thing, having pleasure. Fucking," shouted back Remus, who was still locked by Romulus's submissive hold. "Say that again, and I'll break your arm," shouted Romulus as he twisted Remus's arm even harder. "Ah! Okay," screamed Remus in pain, as Romulus suddenly threw his twin brother out of the room and went back to attend to Amygdala. As Romulus turned around and walked back towards Amygdala, Remus ran to jump him from behind. Amygdala jumped up and confronted the attacking Remus, saying, "Take one more step, and I'll turn your penis into wood." She then extended her left hand, and brilliant blue sparks of electrical energy burst forth from her fingers. Remus stopped dead in his tracks, looked down at his crotch, which he quickly covered with his hands, then ran off, like a dog with its tail between its legs. Romulus helped Amygdala back to bed as she was shaken up by Remus's attempted sexual assault. They looked into each other's eyes, and she captivated the young prince with her beautiful dark green eyes. They kissed, and suddenly the fire of carnal passion was ignited as they made wild, passionate love. It was his first time, and she knew it, period. She felt something very special for Romulus. It was beyond love and transcended space and time. It was a forbidden love, taboo, for she was sent by destiny to help him and his brother reclaim what was rightfully theirs, the throne of Latium. Amygdala was tampering with destiny and playing with fire. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream shattered the serene calm that surrounded the two lovers as they lay in bed, period. The cry came from the room next door. It was the twins' stepfather Faustulus's room. Faustulus was... "What the hell?" shouted Romulus as he jumped out of bed, naked, stumbled across the floor, quickly picked up and put on his clothes, then frantically ran next door, having to kick the door down as it had been intentionally jammed from the inside with a chair. Romulus ran in, shouting, "Father! Father!" There was no response. He saw a draft blowing the green curtains to and fro from the room's window. There, in the bed, stained bright crimson by his father's blood, did Romulus see his slain stepfather, Faustulus. His throat had been viciously slashed open, and his tongue brought out from above and through the gash in his throat, resembling a necktie. It could be said that this type of killing or mutilation was, of sorts, an ancient forerunner of the modern-day Colombian necktie form of killing, popularized by drug-related gangland killings in modern times. Romulus cried as he hugged the blood-soaked body of his dead father. "Who could have done this to you, father? You never hurt a living person in your life. Why? Why?" shouted Romulus as he sobbed and tears seemingly incessantly rolled down his cheeks. Amygdala was deeply moved by Romulus's display of grief and emotion as she carefully looked around the room for clues as to exactly what had happened. There, on the floor, she saw bloody footprints leading from the side of the bed towards the open window, whose curtains flew in the wind. "The killer must have exited through the window," said Amygdala. Romulus seemingly broke out of his incessant crying spell to pay attention to Amygdala. "I'll track that godless fuck down and make him pay dearly," shouted Romulus as he got up and started toward the window to crawl out and follow the killer into the night. "Wait, not yet," said Amygdala, who grabbed Romulus by the left arm and held him back. She removed a necklace from around her neck, from which hung a beautiful gold ring with an emerald at its center. The ring had Hebrew writing on its sides. She removed the ring from the necklace and placed it on her left index. It was the special talisman known as the Ring of Solomon that gave its wearer extraordinary magical powers. She then placed her left hand with ring upon the body's chest. "What in the name of the gods are you doing?" asked Romulus. "Be quiet and trust me," said Amygdala, as she then closed her eyes and said, "Creature of God that was, but is no more, hear and obey me. Who did this to you, and why?" Romulus looked with fear and trepidation in his eyes as he cast his gaze upon the mutilated stepfather's body, wondering how the body, with its tongue coming out of its neck, could possibly speak. There was no response. Amygdala took a deep breath, closed her eyes again, then spoke most forcefully, saying, "Obey me, O departed one, and speak. I command it." Immediately after she said this, a howling gust of cold wind blew into the room through the window, and suddenly Faustulus's violacious cyanotic lips moved as he spoke, despite the fact that his tongue lay lifeless and sticking out from his neck. "What is it you want of me?" he asked. Amygdala opened her eyes. They briefly glowed a dull red, just long enough for Romulus to get a fleeting glimpse of them, before they returned to their natural, beautiful green color. She asked, "Who did this to you, and why, O departed one?" Faustulus's body continued to speak in a monotone, saying, "The man was not too tall and walked with a limp on his right leg. He also had a mole on his left cheek. I do not know why he wanted to kill me. He was hiding under the bed. What did he want from you? What did he ask or say?" asked Amygdala. "He took nothing. He only asked where my sons Remus and Romulus were," replied the bluish-gray, dead corpse, as its cold purple lips moved with every syllable. "Father, it is I, Romulus. How are you? Speak to me," exclaimed a most distraught Romulus, but there was no response from the body. "Speak to me, father. Say something. It is I, your son," said Romulus. "I am sorry, Romulus, but your father's body and spirit can only talk through me, but his spirit or soul can see through time and eternity. Through its, the soul's, two eyes, ergons and parergons." "Is there anything else you can tell us, Faustulus?" asked Amygdala. "No," replied the body. "Your son Romulus misses you and wishes you to know that he loves you, Faustulus," said Amygdala. "I know. Tell King Romulus that I also miss and love him very much too," replied the body, as suddenly Amygdala pulled her left hand away from the body's chest, seemingly hastily and prematurely, breaking the necromantic bond between her and the dead one. "What? Why did you do that?" "He called me king." "Talk to him some more. You said he could see through time and eternity." "Maybe he saw that I was king," said Romulus. "That is enough. I am tired, and my communicative abilities for talking to the dead have been stretched to the limits. I must stop now," she said. But the real reason she stopped was because Faustulus's soul could truly see into the depths of infinity and destiny, and could, in essence, let the cat out of the bag as far as what destiny had in store for not only Romulus, but all of them. This was something she did not want revealed. What Amygdala had just practiced was called necromancy, or the art of talking to the dead, by either voluntarily or involuntarily forcing the soul of the dead corpse to speak and answer questions through the body of the dead person. For as long as a body existed, its soul would tend to linger close to the flesh. The necromancer could see into the future, the past and eternity through the eyes of the dead person's soul. that functioned much like a remote-controlled TV camera with views into space and time. Frustrated, Romulus angrily said, quotations, "I'll take care of this myself," as he jumped out of the window onto the street and followed the killer's trail. Surprisingly, it led around the inn, then back inside through the front door. Like a bloodhound fresh on the trail of a killer, Romulus entered the inn with a dogged determination to find his stepfather's brutal killer. He carefully scrutinized every passing man's face for the presence of a mole, and likewise observed their gait for evidence of a limp. But nowhere was there to be found a man fitting the description given by the dead Faustulus during Amygdala's necromantic session. Into the dining area went Romulus. There, in a dimly lit corner, sat a man alone. He immediately caught Romulus's attention, who then walked towards him, making a beeline straight for him. Romulus walked up to the man, but the side of his face that he, Romulus, was interested in seeing was facing the wall. "Turn around," commanded Romulus. "Make me," replied the mean-looking man defiantly. No matter how hard he tried to get a good glimpse of the stranger's face, see if he could see an identifying mole as revealed by his dead stepfather during Amygdala's necromantic session, he still could not get a good enough look to know with any certainty whether or not the man was the killer, period. Angry, and with his patience worn thin, Romulus shouted, "Get up, you miserable fuck," as he then kicked out the chair from under the stranger. With seeming lightning-fast speed, the stranger sprang up at Romulus, slashing with a knife. As a silvery flash or reflection from the attacker's knife rapidly flickered across Romulus's neck, nicking him and drawing blood. Romulus lifted a chair and placed it between himself and the knife-wielding attacker, who wildly thrust and slashed at him. Romulus forcefully charged at the mad assassin, pushing the man up against the wall, trapping him there with the chair. The killer lashed out with the knife, but due to the chair's length could not reach Romulus, who then violently kicked the gimpy man in the left knee, instantly smashing it. The assassin screamed in horrific pain as he fell to the ground. A crowd was forming around them as Romulus slowly picked up the chair and stomped on the man's left hand that clenched the knife that had been used to so wickedly murder and mutilate Faustulus. Romulus stomped and stomped on the killer's left hand until it became a bleeding, pulpy stump, extracting bleating, blood-curdling cries from the now helpless assassin. Next, Romulus walked over to the chair he had used to defend himself, lifted it up, then suddenly and violently smashed it across the assassin's back. "Enough, Romulus. Stop. Let me question him," shouted Amygdala, but Romulus would hear none of it, and picked up one of the broken chair's legs and proceeded to bludgeon the murderer to death before Amygdala had a chance to question him and find out who had sent him to kill Faustulus. Romulus's powerful blows sent the murderer's eyeballs flying out of their sockets and splattered pieces of skull and brains across the floor and adjacent tables. After taking care of the brutal assassin, Amygdala and Romulus went back to bed, where they lay in each other's arms. As she consoled him, she said, "You must claim the throne, Romulus. It is your destiny." "Me? You mean me and my brother Remus?" "You forget we are twins," replied Romulus. "Yes, it is true, but you were born first, my love, and as such are the rightful heir to the throne," said Amygdala. "How did you know that?" asked Romulus, most surprised. Amygdala just looked at him with her beautiful dark green eyes and smiled. "But we are only two, my brother and I, against the king and his whole army. How are we to depose him?" asked a most skeptical and now agitated Romulus. "Don't worry, I will help you. Besides, the people hate King Amulius, and I'm sure a new, handsome young face such as yours on the throne will be greatly welcomed by the people of Latium," said Amygdala.
If you like this, let me know.
Most confidently. And so the next night, the two young men followed Amygdala to the palace, where she would walk up to the guards, who would be taken by her ravishing beauty, and she would mesmerize them into silence and inactivity. The guards, one by one, became like zombies. "Follow me," she whispered to Remus and Romulus as she guided the two young men through dim, torch-lit passageways into the depths of the castle and into the jaws of the lion. It was as if she knew exactly where she was going, and she did. Eventually, they made it to a long hallway, at the end of which were two 20-foot-tall cedar doors intricately carved with the 12 signs of the zodiac. It was their great-uncle King Amulius's room. "He's in there," whispered Amygdala, as she pointed to the door, period. Romulus looked at Remus, who then looked at Amygdala. "Well, what are you looking at me for? It wasn't my idea to do this. I'm only here for the ride," said Remus to Romulus. As the two young men haggled over who was to enter the king's chamber first, Amygdala just shook her head in disgust, stretched out the fingers of her right hand, and from her fingertips shot forth a bolt of bright white energy that struck the door's massive iron lock, cutting it instantly and quietly. As gray smoke arose from the freshly cut lock, Amygdala gently opened one of the large doors. As the door opened and she snuck inside the king's chamber, she and her two accomplices, who were right behind her, suddenly felt a gust of wind rush past them and into the room. The three walked inside quietly, and behind a thin veil canopy covering the bed, saw the figure of a person lying down. They slowly approached the person in bed, who presumably was the king. Suddenly, there was stirring and motion in the bed, followed by guttural and most sensual moanings. Then, one by one, three heads popped up from under the covers. They were women. There remained one figure still lying down. Romulus quickly grabbed and tore off the bed's veil canopy, revealing the naked king with his three concubines, who had been sensually caressing, kissing, and giving him oral sex. "What the fuck is this? I'll have your heads for this," and shouted King Amulius as he quickly sat up in bed. "Shut up, you miserable shit," barked Remus, who then slapped the king hard across the face, knocking him back onto the bed. "Please leave," said Romulus to the three women, promptly got dressed, and quietly left the king's chamber. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" asked King Amulius. Amygdala stood behind the twin brothers and watched in silence as the drama unfolded. "Don't you remember us, you fuck?" shouted Remus angrily. "Nope, I do not. What is it you want? I have much money. I will give you anything you want. Jewels, gold, women. Yes, more women than you can imagine. Just tell me who was behind this plot to kill me, and I will pay you 10 times what he or they are paying you. Just tell me who those treacherous dogs that hired you are, and I will pay you as I said, and you both will be rich free men, and I will spare your lives. Think about it, but don't take too long, for my palace guard will be here soon, and even if you do kill me then, you will die most horrible deaths. My two young friends," said the king. "You really don't remember us, do you?" said Romulus, as he slowly walked around the bed. Amulius followed him with his eyes and replied, "I don't know what you're talking about." Who are you two? Think back 20 years ago to a warm day when you carried 2 newborn boys in a basket, then threw them into the Tiber River, replied Romulus. The king's eyes opened wide. No, it can't be you. You're dead. This is all a nightmare, and I'll wake up at any moment, said the king most anxiously, as he then tried pinching and slapping himself in an attempt to wake himself from a perceived dream or nightmare, but nothing happened. Amulius just looked around and then realized it was not a dream. Yes, it is we, great uncle. I am Romulus, and that is Remus, my brother. As you can see, we are very much alive, said Romulus. I sensed that there was something special about you 2 boys when you came before me to settle the dispute, said Amulius. Suddenly, approaching footsteps could be heard way down the hallway. Ah, my palace guard comes. You 2 fools are dead. This time I will make certain that you 2 die a most painful and horrible death, and exclaimed King Amulius most confidently with a smile. Quickly, shut the door, shouted Amygdala as the twins both closed the large heavy doors. Amygdala then stretched out both hands as brilliant blue discharges of electrical energy burst forth from them, then shot out, striking the metal latch and welding the door shut. No, what sort of witchcraft is this? You won't get away with this, shouted Amulius. We don't want to get away with anything. We're just going to kill you, shouted Remus, as both brothers then unsheathed their daggers and approached the king, ready to kill him. The palace guard pounded and kicked on the large chamber doors, but could not get in due to Amygdala's expert welding of the door latch using her magic. Help me, Josiah. These criminals are going to kill me, shouted Amulius. Open at once in the name of the king, shouted through the door Josiah, chief of the palace guard. Where are you? Come to me now. Hear me, shouted Amulius desperately as he looked across to every corner of the room. Who are you calling, old fool? No one can save you now, shouted Remus as he and Romulus lifted their daggers, Suddenly, a drop in temperature swept across the room as Amygdala sensed an alien or foreign presence amidst them. She quickly looked across the room, sensing imminent danger, and there, in a dark corner, saw 2 brilliantly blazing violet-colored eyes of orange-red light burst forth from the dark corner. The flashes of orange-red light became elongated with scaly surfaces like serpentine sea monsters and quickly coiled around Amygdala. She screamed in pain as the serpentine energy fields blazed with red flames, squeezing the life out of her like 2 pythons simultaneously burning and constricting her. The twins looked at her in shock and horror. Suddenly, 2 more flashes of light, this time yellow in color, shot out from the dark corner and struck the daggers in each hand, causing both Remus and Romulus to scream in pain and instantly drop the razor-sharp knives to the ground. The twins then turned to King Amulius and were about to jump on him to strangle him when a hooded figure walked out from the dark corner. He had 2 fiery violet-colored eyes. The twins paused to look at the stranger, then turned on Amulius to kill him, when the hooded being lifted his bony, almost skeleton-like left hand and made a waving motion toward the 2 young attackers, instantly paralyzing them and taking possession of them like puppets. The hooded being moved his left hand, and slowly the attacking twins backed away from King Amulius and stood stiff, straight, and silently at attention. The king arose and tied his beautiful iridescent red quirinal robe of state to his waist, then slowly walked past Remus and Romulus, then Amygdala, who was moaning in pain behind the fiery serpentine energy fields, that held her firmly captive. Amulius turned to the violet-eyed, hooded stranger and said, "What took you so long? I thought I was a goner." The hooded one then replied in a low reptilian-like voice, "I wanted to see what they had to say and what they were going to do." "Oh, I see. You were experimenting. All the while I was in terror. Don't forget, you're supposed to protect me, Zoran," said Amulius to the hooded one. He was Zoran, a powerful sorcerer according to all the old accounts, and as far as King Amulius knew, that was all that he was, a sorcerer. In fact, it was Zoran who had sent the gimpy assassin to kill Remus and Romulus, but due to a mistake in the assignment of room numbers in the inn's guest list, the assassin mistakenly entered their father Faustulus' room, surprising him. Afraid of being discovered, the assassin then had to kill the old man, so he, the assassin, could continue on his original mission assigned to him by Zoran, the killing of the twins Remus and Romulus. For the sorcerer, Zoran knew who they were and what they were up to. That is, they were going to kill the king and claim the throne of Latium. Had Romulus let the assassin live long enough for Amygdala to have interrogated him, he would have found out the truth about who was really behind his stepfather Faustulus' death. The king then proceeded to prance around the three captives, strutting like a proud cock, dressed in his very beautiful Quirinal robe of state in bright iridescent red with royal blue highlights and circular designs, looking much like pictures of the yin and yang. He smiled and laughed, saying, "Look at you now, you pathetic little fucks. Did you really think you could kill me, King Amulius? How do you think I got here? Certainly not by being stupid or careless. I enjoyed killing your grandfather, my brother, Numitor. I relished hearing his screams. You don't know how I hated being the younger one, always wearing hand-me-downs, coming in second place. That was not for me. So I took what I wanted, and that meant taking the throne of Latium. When I threw you two little shits in the Tiber rivers to drown, I also tossed your mother, that bitch, Sylvia Rhea. Rhea is so she could drown too. After I killed your grandfather, I put your mother in a convent where she could not or was not supposed to get pregnant and have an heir to the throne. But as fate would have it, Mars, the god of war, fell in love with her and impregnated her. You two were the result of that despicable union." "What? Cat got your tongues? Why don't you say something? Speak, I say," shouted Amulius angrily, knowing well that Zoran's spell over them kept them from speaking and kept them in a zombie-like trance state, totally helpless. Meanwhile, Zoran walked over to Amygdala, who was moaning and groaning in pain, being in a state of somnolence, trapped by the flaming snake-like red energy fields. He was intrigued by her powers of witchcraft and sniffed her up and down and from side to side. Amulius saw this from the corner of his eye and walked over to her. "And who is this bitch you brought with you?" "She's quite pretty for a witch," he said. "She is a druid witch," said Zoran in his creepy reptilian voice. "A druid from the Isles of Britannia. I'm impressed. But why is she here so far away from her homeland?" asked Amulius of Zoran. The hooded sorcerer remained silent. This bothered Amulius, who suddenly developed a worried look on his face as he began to pace across the room, then suddenly bent down to pick up one of the daggers the attackers had dropped on the floor. "Nice dagger," did Amulius, as he admired the knife's beautiful mother-of-pearl grips that reflected beautiful iridescent green, red, purple, and blue colors. He slowly walked over to the two petrified twin brothers, then said, quote, "But I wonder just how sharp it is." He then barely touched the skin on Remus's left arm and gently dragged the knife's tip against the flesh, instantly drawing crimson-colored blood. Remus was in pain but remained silent, mute under Zoran's zombie-like spell. So this was to be one of the instruments of my death. Well, now it will be the instrument of your deaths, as I slit each of your throats like the sacrificial lamb, said Amulius as he lifted up the razor-sharp dagger to deliver the lethal blows to each of the twins. A loud cry rang across the room, and both Amulius and Zoran quickly turned toward the source of the ghastly cries. It was Amygdala. She was screaming horribly in pain, as if she were being burned alive. Both Amulius and the sorcerer stared in wonderment at her. Zoran's face could not be seen, being located way to the back of the large hood he wore over his head. Only his brilliantly blazing violet-colored eyes could be seen in the blackness that was where his face should have been. "What's the matter with the bitch?" asked Amulius, anxious to get back to killing the two young men. Zoran said nothing and approached the incarcerated druid witch, examining her closely, up and down and from side to side, sniffing her intermittently. The serpentine, flame-like red energy field flowed around her, constricting her like a large snake. Nothing appeared to be amiss, but Zoran felt somewhat uneasy and said in the low reptilian voice with a hiss, "I don't like it. Something is not right. I sense." Then after this, suddenly, before the violet-eyed sorcerer could finish his sentence, Amygdala's body began to fade in and out of focus and began to turn white. She was quickly freezing and turning into ice. Amulius and Zoran looked at each other in amazement. Then the closer of the two to her, Zoran, began to back away when suddenly Amygdala's ice effigy completely melted. The ice turned into water and completely bathed the snake-like red energy field, causing it to short out and explode violently, hurling Zoran across the room and slamming him against the wall, which he then bounced off of before falling to the floor. Remus and Romulus remained in their trance-like state, oblivious to the world. The blast also knocked down Amulius, who dropped the dagger from his left hand. A cloud of steam or water vapor was all that remained of the witch and the snake-like incarcerating energy field. The vapor cloud began to condense into an oblong white object that soon took the shape of an hourglass-like figure that quickly began to take on sharper form. In less than 10 seconds, arms, legs, hands, feet, and a head materialized. It was Amygdala. She materialized completely from the steam cloud. She was stark naked and beautiful, all 38, 23, 36 inches of her. "Quick, do something, you fool. She's back," shouted Amulius to Zoran, who was still on the floor recovering from the effects of the steam explosion. The naked druid witch uttered a rapid druid incantation, then quickly ran to the twins and slapped each one in the face, instantly awakening them. They then grabbed Amulius. "Get away from me, you fucks." "Zoran, help me," shouted King Amulius most desperately. Suddenly, Zoran, whose robe and hood had been blown off by the explosion, jumped up to the ceiling, where he slowly crawled around like a spider. He had virtually no flesh and was in essence a skeleton. Zoran just shook his head as he stayed staring at them from the high ceiling of the king's chamber, where he crawled like a spider. His eyes glowed a beautiful violet color. "I will be back for you three later. Destiny tells me that it is not yet your time," said Zoran, or the Grim Reaper. as he slowly looked at each one, Remus, Romulus, and Amygdala. "But what about me, Zoran? I'm your master. You help me at once," commanded Amulius. As Amulius said this, both Remus and Romulus picked up their daggers from the floor, then ran back to Amulius, grabbing him as he tried to run. Zoran, or death, just looked at Amulius, grinned, then said, "Nobody lives forever," as he then suddenly jumped from the ceiling like a spider and crashed through a window, disappearing into the dark, starless night. King Amulius looked at Remus and Romulus with great terror in his eyes as the twins frowned, lifted their daggers high, then stabbed him repeatedly. Remus from the back and Romulus from the front. The king fell to the floor in a pool of blood. The king was dead. Long live the king. Romulus quickly tore down a drape and gave it to Amygdala so she could cover herself. Apparently, the palace guard hadn't been idle, for there were two rapid, loud blows against the door, followed by a horrific crashing sound as the two chamber doors flew open from the force of a large battering ram that had been brought up and deployed by the palace guard. Josiah, chief of the palace guard, immediately stormed into the chamber with sword lifted high. As soon as he saw the dead king, he swung at Romulus. The rest of the palace guard surrounded Josiah, Remus, Romulus, and Amygdala. "This twit is mine," exclaimed Josiah, as he planned to kill Romulus with extreme prejudice. "I'm going to gut you like a pig, boy. Then I'll let my men torture and ravish the other two," said the mean chief of the palace guard as he thrust and sliced at Romulus, cutting into his left arm. Romulus screamed in pain as a streak of crimson-colored blood ran from his wound and dripped onto the floor. It was an obviously unfair fight, what with Josiah wielding a sword and Romulus holding a puny dagger. Suddenly, one of the guards thrust at Romulus with his sword, disobeying Josiah's orders to keep out of the fight. Quickly, Romulus turned, ran his dagger straight through the insubordinate soldier's throat, then took his sword. Seeing this, the chief of the palace guard backed away as Romulus expertly twirled, sliced, and thrust into the air at imaginary foes with his newly acquired sword. It was a most impressive exhibition of swordsmanship, and one which Josiah had not counted on. For as far as he knew, Remus and Romulus were just two country boy peasant shepherds. Apparently, as shepherds, the twins learned how to wield a staff with expert ability to the point that it carried over naturally to wielding a sword. "Come on, Josiah. Afraid to attack an armed man?" said Romulus. Josiah was somewhat of a hothead and could not and would not stand to be humiliated or insulted in such a fashion before his men. "Just for that, I'll cut your tongue out before I butcher you," shouted the chief of the palace guard as he lunged and thrust at Romulus, who jumped up high and behind the raving attacker. Josiah quickly turned around as Romulus sliced once, creating a bright silvery flash before him as the blade's mirror-like polish reflected the candlelight. Suddenly, Josiah's right arm fell off from the shoulder, followed by a gurgling sound as a bright red line of blood formed around his neck, and 2 seconds later, his head fell off and rolled on the floor, stopping at Romulus's feet. Josiah's stiff body then suddenly collapsed.
If you like this, let me know.